One day when I was about 12 years old, I was at a garage sale looking through a box of Sega games, and I found this strange monstrosity. Even though it said Genesis 32X on it, I didn't really know what it was, and the lady that was selling it didn't even know what it was either. She wanted $10 for it, but ended up giving it to me for free because I bought 5 Sega games. At that time, the 32X and retro consoles in general were not as valuable, but now it's hard to find a used one for less than $200, and you still need a Sega Genesis in order to use it. The 32X was a failure and is usually viewed as the beginning of the end for Sega, but the system itself is actually quite underrated, and its library of games is actually surprisingly strong. In this video, we're going to look at the history of the 32X and some of its games. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you still have a 32X, please let me know in the comments.
A scientist creates the ultimate machine.
At last!
A machine that will give him the power to journey into the mega world with thousands of colors, 16-bit graphic technology.
In the early 1990s, all you heard about when it came to video games was bits. The Nintendo Entertainment System, which dominated the 80s, was an 8-bit console. When the Sega Genesis burst onto the scene, it was a 16-bit, and was advertised as being so much more powerful than the Nintendo.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
In fact, Sega was so proud of its 16 bits that in some versions of the console, they actually advertised it directly on top of the system. Now, over time, consoles got more powerful. The Super Nintendo was released, which was also a 16-bit system, and eventually the Nintendo 64 would be released, which, you guessed it, had 64 bits. So what exactly are bits? Well, that's a good question, and believe it or not, most people that play video games don't know or care what they are. All they knew was that the higher the number, the more powerful it was. But if you really wanted to know, bits refer to the processing power of the console. The higher the bits, the quicker it could process information. Think of it like a pack of crayons. If you wanted to color a picture with a box of 8 crayons, it would look pretty good. But it would look even better if you had a box of 16 or 32 crayons. Technology moves quickly, and by 1993 the console wars were heating up. The Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis were battling it out, but that year a new contender would enter the ring, when Atari introduced the Jaguar, a 64-bit console. Now, the Jaguar ultimately failed, and people have since claimed that it wasn't even a true 64-bit console to begin with, since it actually had two 32-bit chips. But both Sega and Nintendo realized that if they didn't start planning for the future, a new console was going to eventually show up and beat them.
Have you experienced the awesome power of the Panasonic Real 3DO system?
That same year, in 1993, another console launched, the 3DO. This was a high-end 32-bit system that was actually pretty good and was even named Time Magazine's Product of the Year. But just like the Jaguar, the 3DO would also fail to catch on. And to be honest, I don't know anyone that had a Jaguar or a 3DO when I was growing up. But still, the 1-2 punch of these two consoles caused a panic at Sega. They needed a new console and they needed one quick. They also knew that eventually Nintendo would come up with something as well. Now, it's important to understand that even though the Sega Genesis was super popular in America, it always struggled in Japan. Sega of America, led by Tom Kalinske, had made the Genesis a hit by aggressively marketing it as a hip, cool console. During a private meeting in Las Vegas at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama proposed creating a 32-bit console that would launch by the end of the year, just in time for the holidays. But Tom Kalinske and Sega of America didn't like the idea. Genesis sales were still strong. Kalinske and his team worried that releasing a new console too soon would not be fair to consumers who had already purchased the Genesis, and it would make people less likely to buy Sega consoles in the future. So they came to an agreement. Instead of creating a new console, they made an add-on, or I guess you could call it an adapter, for the Genesis that would give it the same power as a 32-bit console. It was actually a great idea that was in the consumer's best interest. Instead of having to buy a new console, you just bought a new part and plugged it in. Computers kind of work that way. You can swap out older components like graphics cards for new ones instead of buying an entirely new system. Sega called this Project Mars. It wasn't Sega's first attempt to extend the Genesis's life. In 1989, they released the Power Base converter to play Master System games. The Master System was Sega's 8-bit console that sold horribly in the USA. Then came the Sega CD in 1992, which was a device that allowed the Genesis to play disc-based games. While all this was going on, Sega of Japan was secretly developing the Sega Saturn, a standalone 32-bit console. In fact, the 32X used dual Hitachi SH2 processors, the same chips being used in the Saturn. They did this so it would be easier for game developers to switch to making games for the Saturn when it came out. In just a few months at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, they unveiled the Genesis Super 32X, later shortened to just 32X. People were really optimistic and loved the idea of being able to play your old games, but also have the benefit of being able to play new games that supported 32 bits without having to buy an entire new system. That fall, the final version was locked in, a mushroom-shaped device that plugged into the Genesis cartridge slot. The 32X officially launched in North America on November 21st, 1994. It was priced at $159.99 and marketed as an affordable way to upgrade your Genesis into a 32-bit machine. It had enhanced graphics with 3D capabilities, better audio, plus the over 32,000 colors. But while all this was going on in America, Sega of Japan decided to launch the Saturn. Literally the day after the 32X launched, Sega started selling the Saturn in Japan. Just as Tom Kalinske predicted, people lost faith in the 32X. They didn't see any reason why they should buy a 32X if a fully brand new console was going to come out any day now. Basically, think of it like this. Let's say Sony decided to sell a PlayStation 5.5, but at the same time announced that the PlayStation 6 would be coming out soon as well. No one's going to invest money in the PlayStation 5.5 if the PlayStation 6 is going to be out in a few months. One could argue that Kalinske and Sega of America should have just gone along with Japan and skipped the 32X going straight to the Saturn. The Sega Genesis had already been out for about 5 years at that point anyway. Even with all the news about the Saturn, early sales of the 32X were pretty good. It launched with 600,000 units and some stores sold out instantly. But the 32X was actually pretty annoying to set up. You don't just plug it into your Genesis, it also has its own AC adapter and video cables. Plus, you had to use these metal pieces to prevent signal interference. And since there were multiple Genesis models, you had to figure out which one you had and use a spacer to make sure the 32X fit appropriately. The AC adapter for both the 32X and the Genesis were also larger than normal plugs, so if you were using a plug strip near your TV, it would be difficult to plug both of them in, especially if you had anything else plugged into the strip, like a VCR or the TV itself. And if you had a Sega CD attachment with the Genesis and the 32X, that had its own AC adapter as well. So it was actually impossible to hook all these parts up to the same standard surge protector. There were so many complaints that Sega made its own plug strip just for this. And it was actually kind of genius what they did. They just turned the outlet sideways so everything would fit better. I'm actually surprised that this isn't standard by now. Sega promised that the 32X would launch with 12 games, but only 3 were available: Virtua Racing Deluxe, Doom, and Star Wars Arcade. Kids who got the system were really upset because there wasn't a Sonic game. The Blue Hedgehog was literally the mascot of Sega, and they didn't have a Sonic game for their new console. Nintendo always made sure they had a Mario game on every console they released. Even the Virtual Boy had a Mario game. While all this was going on at Sega, Nintendo released one of the biggest games on the SNES, Donkey Kong Country. It launched the exact same week as the Sega 32X and became the 3rd best-selling game of all time on the Super Nintendo. The hype for that game was incredible. It had one of the largest marketing campaigns ever and was one of the most visually stunning games made at the time. It actually looked better than the games on the Sega 32X. Despite what people have said over the years, the launch titles for the 32X were pretty solid. Virtua Racing Deluxe looked really good, but a lower quality version of the game was released on the Genesis, so you could still play the game without upgrading. Although the Genesis version of this game has a special chip, so it actually costs $100, which is even more than the 32X version of the game. Star Wars Arcade was the best-selling game on the system, but that's probably because it was so recognizable. I think the game is kind of okay for what it is. It was definitely the most visually impressive Star Wars game at the time. But I was mostly impressed with the 32X version of Doom. I loved that game. I know it's clearly inferior to the PC version, but I still enjoyed playing it. It actually amazes me that the console could even run it, and it looked and ran much better than the Super Nintendo version. Only a total of 40 games were ever released for the 32X, and a few were only released in certain regions. A lot of the games were good and fun, but most of them were available on the Genesis without the 32X or even available on the Super Nintendo. It was clear that most of the games were rushed. Keep in mind that the 32X was developed and released in less than a year, so most developers didn't really have time to utilize the 32X's capabilities. Within just a few months, everybody realized the 32X was a complete failure. Not only was there little demand, but the developers didn't want to spend money making games for the system, they wanted to work on games for the Saturn, so the developers abandoned the console within a few months. Sega invited a group of musicians, reporters, and game developers to a giant party in San Francisco to try to hype up the 32X. But the people at the party were so bored that they tried to leave early and then got upset because Sega had bused them all to the event and then sent the buses away after everyone got there. So everyone was stuck at this party just playing Virtua Racing all night. Sega had plans to release a Genesis and 32X combo called the Neptune, but when they realized how badly the system was doing, they canceled it. The 32X cost $159 when it launched, which I think is way too high. $159 in 1994 is equal to about $340 today. That is a lot of money for something that is just an adapter, not even a new console. It actually cost the same as a brand new Sega Genesis at the time. Also, the price of the games was $70 each. That's about $150 in today's economy. In October 1995, Sega gave up. CEO Hayao Nakayama ordered the company to cease support for all systems except the Saturn. The price of the 32X had already dropped to $99, but it would drop even further to just $19. That's right, something that started off costing $159 in less than a year would be sold in bargain bins for just $19. Sega fans saw the 32X as a betrayal. What was supposed to be something in the consumer's best interest turned out to be a waste of money for most people who bought it. Think about it, people paid tons of money for this, and it was abandoned in less than a year. Even the Google Stadia lasted 3 years. What was meant to be a bridge to the future became an example of the dangers of a company clinging to its past. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and if you remember playing any of these 32X games, please let me know.